I want to welcome everybody to the CoCoTax Lunchtime Speaker Series. Today we are doing something we normally don't do. We have our speaker on his iPhone because we had some last minute changes. So we appreciate your tolerance on that. And if there's something that you missed, you can always watch the replay, which will be up over this weekend on our website and on YouTube. I'm asking you to please use your chat function, which you will find either at the bottom or side of your screen if you have any questions. And we're going to try not to interrupt our speaker unless a clarification is needed. And then we'll try to save the other questions for the end. But if you think of something and you don't want to lose that idea, feel free to put it in the chat function. I'll be writing it down and then we'll address it later. One last thing, we're going to take a short break somewhere around 12:20 so that our speaker can handle some business that shouldn't take more than a couple of minutes. And I'll have a few announcements then. So anyway, at this time, I know you've all read his bio, but I'm very pleased that we were able to work with Stanford University, and we have Joe Nation, who handles the pension tracker. And he'll tell you a little bit about how the pension tracker is operated and how you can get information on California's public pensions through using the pension tracker. It's a very handy little device when you want to know where your tax dollars are going when it comes to the pension system. And it also, he'll be talking a little about how solid the pension problem is or is not in California. So at this point, I will shut up and I'm going to turn it over to our speaker, Joe Nation. Hi, Joe.
Okay, Sue, thank you. I'm hoping that the audio is okay. Weird situation that I have to be in a car. I have to have a mask on, and have to interrupt this halfway through. Apologize for that, but hopefully this will be of interest to you. If there's follow-up afterwards, just let me know. I will have my contact information on the very last slide. So if you guys can go ahead and share the screen, share your screen. You have the slides there.
Okay, slide will be up in just a moment.
Great. Okay, I see it. All right. So,
good.
Everyone, when I've been working on this issue for, I guess, 11 years now, 12 years. And periodically people will say, well, gee, isn't this better than it used to be? And the answer is no. Despite the fact that we've had some good markets, and despite the fact that there have been a couple of other minor improvements, it's still really bad. That's the overall message. Next slide shows the outline for today, things we're going to cover. So I want to start with how we got to where we are today. And I want to talk a little bit about bubble pensions and how they're unique. They're very different from pensions in the private sector. Third thing I want to talk about is whether we should worry, and if so, how much. And then finally, policy options going forward. Next slide, please. So the pension tracker site that Sue mentioned has been around for about 6 or 7 years, I guess now. We actually have a new home. We moved from Steeper to the Bill Lane Center on the west, which seems a little odd probably. But Steeper doesn't support these sort of research projects anymore. So the Bill Lane Center, just FYI, is a pretty good sized center at Stanford that focuses on the Americas tracker. We are probably not going to be able to update this with 2019 data until sometime in the spring. We have got the data we need from CalPERS and from CalSTRS, but there are about 100 roughly independent systems across the state. For example, Contra Costa's system is independent. The San Francisco City and County system is independent. And we have to actually collect those data from each of those sources, and they release at different times. So when those are done, then we'll be able to post the California data, 2019 data. And again, we're not going to be able to do that for probably about 2, maybe 3 months, I guess. The next slide shows the screenshots of the U.S. pension tracker. We have completed the data collection. We have a couple of states that have some data that look a little funny, so we're verifying that. I would think that we would have this updated with 2019 data in about roughly 2 weeks. You might say, well, wait a minute, Joe, you're saying 2019 data when it's 2021, and that's because all of these typically, unfortunately, lag in their data reporting. Doesn't matter if it's a state system, a county system, a city system, whatever. They typically take longer than they should to report this. So the 2019 data have been being released over the last several months, and again, we should have all those done in about 6 months or so. Right? Okay. Next slide, please. So, as we discussed this today, I want you guys to keep something in mind, and that is that this is not really complicated. This is not higher math. This is not, third semester calculus. It's really pretty simple. And in fact, it was, you can go to the next slide. Governor Jerry Brown, when he was attempting pension reform back in 2011, said this is 5th grade arithmetic. That's not quite the case, but it's not all that complicated. What makes it complicated is the way that public pension systems account for their assets and their liabilities. That's what's complicated. So the math is easy. The assumptions and the rules, if you will, that they abide by, that they operate under, make it complicated. Next slide, please. So you probably wondering, well, where did this all begin? And it began with Ricky Martin in 1999. Actually, not Ricky Martin, but the song that was popular in 1999 was actually a song that Ricky Martin, if anyone remembers him, was sang. And so, Living La Vida Loca, which of course means living the crazy life. And I picked that song because it is a little bit crazy what's happened in the public pension world. Just as I thought it was funny as I was finalizing these slides this morning, I looked for Ricky Martin images and I came up with Angela Merkel. So it just shows you how, these automated systems that we have don't always give you the right images. So again, life was good in 1999, and it sort of set us up for the situation we're in today. Next slide, please. I would actually good in terms of the economy and generally otherwise in 1999. It's really great. The stock market was on a high. The S&P has risen 225% over about a 7-year period. Average rate was nearly 16%. The unemployment rate, after defense downsizing and some other economic pains in the state of California, unemployment rate fell from 9.7 to 5%. So people were feeling pretty high, and the state's general fund budget, which isn't always in great shape, climbed nearly 40%. So things were really looking good in the end of the 1990s. Next slide, please. And so what happens when the times are good? Well, people do things that they shouldn't do. They have a lot of parties, they celebrate, they sort of assume that things are going to be just fine. Or even better, that the problems have all disappeared. And that's what happened in 1999. Next slide, please. And the most significant thing that happened then is that, and remember this, and I'm a Democrat, I'm a pretty partisan Democrat, but 1999 was the first year that the Democrats, in 16 years, that the Democrats controlled both houses of the legislature and the governor's office. Pete Wilson had been governor 8 years, George Mason had been governor 8 years before that, both Republicans. And they had done a lot of things that public employees liked. So when Democrats took over in 1999, they said, well, we're going to expand all these benefits and we're going to do things that reward public employees. And there were two bills in particular that they introduced, and both were passed. The first was SB, or Senate Bill 400, which was introduced and passed in 1999. And it focused on state employees covered by CalPERS. And 2 years later, 616 was passed, and it focused on providing the same benefits to local government employees. And I tell people that I made a mistake, I think, in voting for AB 616. And I voted for it because every one of my districts back in Marin and Sonoma counties, all the local government folks, said they had to have it. And they said they had to have it because they couldn't compete with the state anymore. Because the state was able to lure workers away because they'd expanded these benefits in 1999. I'll tell you a little bit about the expansion in just a second. So again, by 2001, you had this enhancement of public employee benefits all across California. Some of the examples of what changed. So, for example, if you were a California Highway Patrol person in 1999, before this was passed, you had what was called a 2% of 50 benefit plan. That meant that you got 2% times your years of service times your last 3-year salary. So let's say that you made $100,000 those last 3 years, and you worked for 30 years. It'll be 30 times 2, or 60% times that final 3-year salary average. That was changed to 3% and 50. So literally, if you were scheduled to retire, let's say you were late 1999, you were going to retire in early 2000. If that was your plan to retire in early 2000, your pension benefit increased by as much as 50% overnight. So if you were expected to get $60,000 a month, you automatically were going to be eligible, and you would receive $90,000. Per year. So it's a huge increase. The retirement pay was also based not on your last 3 years of working in your salary, but 1 year. And of course, people start pushing up those model year salaries. And in fact, across California now, superintendents in school districts, very often get what they call a pension bump in their last year. They give an extra 10% because they know that will end up pushing up their pension by that same amount. The last thing that I want to point out is that this actually, SB 400 actually included retroactive benefits or retroactive benefit increases. So you actually were able to, even if you had quit, let's say you'd already quit, you actually got an additional paycheck from the state. And in some cases, there was a retroactive pay for people back to who had quit back in 1974. Just over here. Next slide, please. sorry about that. Okay, so, all right. So then on the next slide, so that's sort of the legislation that got us in the position that we're in, right? The legislation got us to a place where there were these expanded benefits and so forth, and that sort of blew the lid off across California. I want to focus on a couple of things that show the differences, and this is again explaining how we got here, the differences between public and private pension funding policies. So, and I'm going to focus on a couple of these, but one of these is, and again, very different rules. So public systems have policies, funding policies that are completely different than the private sector. Interestingly enough, the US is the only one that really does this. Public pensions that are funded in Canada, the Netherlands, elsewhere, have effectively the same sort of rules they have in the private sector. So the public sector has carved out this huge advantage that allows them, in my opinion, to abuse the system and abuse the process and put it all in danger. The discount rate or the investment rate of return for the public sector is simply the rate at which you think you're going to earn funds. That's 7% today, way too high. And it used to be actually 8.5% in California, but now it's down to 7% for most systems. In the private sector, they have to use the rate on high quality corporate bonds, which are about half of that roughly. So you see that the public sector is able to say, don't worry, we're going to earn a lot. We'll earn our way out of this effectively. The other thing is that I want to focus on is the amortization period and the differences in those policies. So in the private system, if you lose money, let's say you have a funding target of, a certain rate of return target, and you get less than that, you're targeting 5 and you get 3, you have to build in an amortization tranche and you have to pay that off over a certain amount of time. You actually have 7 years to pay that off per federal law. In the public sector, you can take as many as 30 years to pay that off. So it's like someone who has a credit card debt who says, you know what, I'm just going to take 30 years to pay this off. Well, if you do that, you're going to pay a lot more. There are all sorts of other things I won't go into detail on, except maybe I'll mention the last one, which is this concept of a benefit freeze. So if you're in bad shape in the private sector, right? Let's say that you're in bad shape, and hang on a second, someone's trying to call me. If you're in, oh, you still there? Yes, good.
They call from here.
Maybe. Oh, actually, this might be a good time to take that break. I mean, we're sitting here in the parking lot. Sorry. Is it okay if we take a break? Because I think that may have been the folks I'm supposed to meet.
Yep, no problem.
Okay, I'll be back as soon as I can.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Hopefully this will pop over to my face. Lucky you. We're going to take this moment to remind people that this is the Contra Costa Taxpayers Association, whose mission is good government at affordable cost. And there, everybody's back. And I have reduced everybody's faces. If you're using a video system, at the moment, I have closed off all of your video capabilities for most people. Yeah, Mike McGill, you're still there. And we're trying to improve the sound quality, and we'll see how it works. But if you're not a member of Contra Costa Taxpayers, you should be. And you can go to our website at www.cocotax.org. Click on membership. We'd be happy to include you. We are a nonprofit organization, and we run on a shoestring, just like we want the government to do. And in order for us to represent the taxpayers, unfortunately, it always takes money, and it takes volunteers, and it takes focus. So please join us and take an active role. A couple of quick announcements. Just today, we found out that the Measure X Oversight Committee is accepting applications. Now you'll remember that Measure X was the Contra Costa County half-cent sales tax increase countywide that passed in November. And part of the deal with that is Oversight Committee. So this is a really great way for you to keep an eye on where your tax dollars going, how they're spent, how much is coming in. They're expecting $81 million. And so the Board of Supervisors is going to give you access to how that half-cent sales tax is being distributed. And we'd love to have your participation. Do not miss this opportunity if you really want to have a voice in how your tax dollars are sent. Oversight committees are one of the few ways that you can take an active role without being an elected official or serving in some huge capacity that's going to take up 20 to 40 hours a week. This will not do that. Also going to let you know that we have just booked a speaker for March 19th. And that will be our county treasurer and tax collector, Russell Watts. And luckily, Rusty is on this phone call. And so we have him booked for that day. You will not want to miss it. That will be noon, March 19th. We're going to try to schedule a few more speakers concentrating on Contra Costa County in the month of March. April's kind of the taxpayer system time. So a lot of people are thinking about it. We want to see what our county's position is before we step into that. Joe, are you back with us?
I am back.
Okay. And I will let everybody know that we'll be having a CoCoTax general membership meeting anticipated for April 23rd, but you'll be hearing from us a lot before then. So Joe, if you're ready to come back.
All set.
Okay.
All right. Thanks everyone. I mean, I know this is weird. I will just explain what's going on. So my wife just flew in from Brazil a few days ago, and she has to get a COVID test. She has no symptoms, but per protocol, and so the only time they gave us today was 12:20. So that's why we have driven to this parking lot, and she's just gone in to do her test. So anyway, I apologize. It's been a little bit awkward. I've never quite done this exactly, but nor have I ever done this wearing a mask. All right. So the last thing I wanted to, again, I was focusing on was this issue of the benefit freeze. And again, the point is that, okay, that in the private sector, if you actually, can you turn the car on? Yeah. In the private sector, if you are underfunded, one of the sanctions is you actually freeze your benefits if you get below a certain level. In the public sector, there's no sanction whatsoever. There's really no corrective action that's required, unlike the private sector. So again, to sum up, these are very different systems, very liberal, if you will, provisions on the public sector side that have led us into the mess that we're in right
now. Next slide. The one that says what market now? There it is. Okay, great. Thank you. So I mentioned the discount rate and this assumption that they're going to earn 7% per year forever. And if you look at the Federal Reserve's research, or McKinsey or BlackRock or anyone else out there, they will tell you that in fact a more reasonable rate is 4 or 5%. And that comes from the mix of assets you have, whether you have income, bonds, equity, etc. But the point is that the assumed rate of return that the public sector makes, 7% today, is probably way too ambitious. Next slide, please. versus the actual rate of return for CalPERS over certain periods of time. Again, the discount rate is what you a priori say you're going to, hit 7%, and the actual rate of return is what you actually got. And as you can see here, I've picked 4 different time periods. I've gone from 5 up to 30 years. Next slide, please. And you show that in the last 5 and the last 20 years, CalPERS has actually underperformed significantly. Let's just focus on the last 20 years. So over a 20-year period, CalPERS has actually earned about 2% per year on average less than they anticipated. Well, and anyone knows who can do simple arithmetic that if you miss your investment target by 2%, you are going to create a big hole and a big funding problem, and that's exactly what's happened with CalPERS. Next slide, please. What that has led to is CalPERS is actually probably taking even more risk and shooting for even higher returns than they should be today. They're using leverage more. They're buying a lot more private equity. Some people would say that this is the baseball equivalent of swinging for the fences. They know they're not well funded, and so the best way to get out of this is to take a chance. The odds are it won't work, but if you talk to actuaries out there in the public and the private sector, they will tell you that that's about the only chance they have. And I think that's part of what's happened with CalPERS, in particular this increase in private equity. Next slide. So I wanted to highlight this other issue of amortization policy differences between private and public sectors. So I went ahead and I just created a chart. I actually borrowed this from someone that shows the amount that you have to pay per year if you amortize over 30 years. And it is based on a $32 million loss amortized over 30 years. So you can see in the red line there, the red line actually shows the unfunded balance. And so what happens is, because the gold line shows that you don't even make any payment at all the first couple of years. And the public sector typically permits this amortization lag that you don't even require. It's like someone with a credit card. They owe $10,000 and they say, you know what, I'm going to wait 2 years before I start paying. Well, you know what happens then. You don't pay $10,000. You don't owe $10,000 in 2 years. You owe $11,000 or $12,000, whatever the numbers are. And the point I want to make here is that the payments that are made occur very slowly at first, because they ramp up, as you can see in the gold. So they ramp up slowly, and then they get, then they increase sort of steadily over time, and then they fall pretty precipitously towards the end. And that means that what that means specifically for California pension systems today is that all these losses we've been racking up over time, over the last 20 or so years, have just really, some of them are just starting to be felt. In other words, because, you sort of delay payment and you put off payment, it's going to be a long-term recovery that's required. Next slide, please. And one point I want to make is that in this example, you don't return to your original loss amount, that $32 million, until year 23. So in other words, you effectively make no progress towards paying off that accumulated pension debt until year 23. Now, most systems have gone to, a 30, or they've gone from 30 to 20. They've reduced it. That's a good thing, but 20 years is still too long. It ought to be something closer to 7 years as they have in the private sector. Next slide, please. So that gives you a sense of how we got here, why we're in the condition we're in. And the question I always ask people is, should we worry about this? Is this a big deal? And I actually teach a class, I'm teaching a class this quarter on California policy issues. And we just covered this subject a couple of days ago. And I told the students that I thought there was no other significant or a problem as significant as this one for state and local government. In California, across the country, we have lots of challenges, without a doubt. Certainly in the middle of a pandemic, we have healthcare challenges. We have healthcare challenges otherwise. We have problems in terms of, improving our schools and so forth. But the financial health of public pensions is something we really need to care about. So if you look at this chart, this simply shows the funded ratio of CalPERS from 1993 until 2019, the most recent year that's available in the aggregate. And on the left-hand side just shows the ratio of assets to liabilities. And you can see that back in the 1990s, it was, in pretty good shape, between 100 and even 140%. Now, I would argue that because they had these assumptions that were unrealistic and so forth, those were not real numbers, but these are the numbers they reported. So even under CalPERS numbers, they've gone from 100 to 140% to now about 70 or so percent, a little more than 70%. That means simply that you have about 70 cents on the dollar, 70 cents that you owe to retirees and others who are heading towards retirement for every dollar that you actually, $70 in the bank for every, or 70 cents in the bank for every dollar that you owe to people in the short and the long term. So, it could be worse. It could be the Chicago teacher system, which is horribly funded, even worse than this. And people have to ask themselves, are they comfortable with 70%? And even in the public sector, they say that they think the minimum funded level should be about 80 to 90%. So we're not even at the levels that the people in the public sector believe is appropriate. And again, I think those are much too low. Next slide, please. This is a duplicate slide. If you can go just straight to the next one, please. Thank you. So I wanted to focus on the period from 2009 to 2019. And the reason for that is that you see that the funded ratio has been pretty flat, a little bit up, a little bit down, but for the most part, it really isn't very high, right? It hasn't recovered to where it was before 2009, certainly not to the levels it was in the 1990s. And next slide, please. And what is so distressing about that is that even though the market has been, some people would argue, on fire, the public employee pension system funded ratio, again, assets to liabilities, hasn't really changed much. In fact, if you index these, so you set 1993 equal to 100, and you look at the relative change over this nearly 30-year period, you can see that CalPERS is fairly flat, and the S&P 500 is up by, a factor of 3. And the reason for that is because it's not all about assets, it's about liabilities. And until the public employee pension system begins to pay attention to liabilities, they're not going to get out of this mess that they are in. Next slide, please. If you look at the unfunded liability that CalPERS has, and again, I'm picking on CalPERS, they're the biggest system, but this would be the same for Contra, Costa, CalSTRS, LA City, San Francisco, San Jose, you name it. It's all about the same. The numbers are all pretty bad. So, and then someone's just asking, how does the UC system? I didn't see the entire message, but the UC system is also in not good shape, but they're actually relatively better off, I believe. I don't track UC really closely, but I think they're actually slightly better. But it's the same sort of system. One thing the UC system did, though, is they started giving people the option of a defined benefit or a defined contribution system a few years ago. And a fair number of people have opted for that, and that's helped them, I think, a little bit. So this slide shows the unfunded liability for CalPERS. And if you believe their numbers, they will tell you that they're about, I'm trying to read my slide here, I think it's about 150 or so billion dollars. So in other words, they need to find $150 billion They need to invest their way out of this by to the tune of 150 to the tune of $150 billion, something along those lines. That's using their math. That's using their assumptions. If you actually do what every financial economist on the planet thinks you should do, and you assume, if you basically adopt the rules that are in the private sector or close to the private sector, that $150 billion unfunded liability ends up being around $700 billion. So if you discount at a risk-free rate, so you discount your liabilities, it's a little bit technical, that ends up being a much higher number. And if you make a lower assumption about investment rates of return, which you should, that ends up being creating a bigger gap there. You end up with about a $700 billion unfunded liability. That's just for CalPERS. When you add in CalSTRS and independent and so forth, in the state of California, you get up to about $1.2 trillion. Next slide, please. So let's just worry about CalPERS for a second. Is $700 billion a lot of debt? Well, compare that with this year, the budget that was just proposed by the governor. That $700 billion is 4 times the general fund budget, which is $165 billion. It is 8 times the general obligation bond debt, which is around $71 billion today. It ends up being around $55,000 per household. And again, that's just CalPERS. If you add in other, CalSTRS and independents and UC, it ends up being not quite, but pretty close to $100,000 per household. So think of it in terms of every household out there having effectively a bill that they will have to pay, that someone will have to pay. Maybe it won't be the household, maybe it'll be somebody else, maybe there'll be a federal bailout, unlikely, but it ends up being over $1 trillion and about 100,000 per household. It's particularly bad at the local level. There are some agencies at the local level where their market pension debt actually exceeds their annual payroll. So it's a huge problem for them. Next slide, please. So that debt is a problem, but I would argue that this is even a bigger problem. What's a bigger problem is that as state, county, city, special district governments, as they're facing these higher pension costs, that they're not funding things that they should be funding. And I did a study about 3 years ago now that found the following. It showed that at the state level, what was being crowded out, in other words, things that were being funded less than what they'd been historically funded, at the state level are social services and higher education. Those social services, as you see in the footnote at the bottom of this, typically are for people who are less fortunate, people who are low income. Counties have reduced public assistance, welfare, public protection, cops, firefighters, et cetera, and healthcare to pay for pensions. Cities tend to have not quite as much pressure, and they've cut things like libraries, parks, recreational services. There's some evidence that public safety has been cut in those cities. And then in school districts, it's mostly about salaries. There's a San Jose Unified School District, for example. The San Jose Unified School. Okay. The San Jose Unified School District has actually more or less stopped giving pay increases for a year. They just give lump sum payments because that doesn't figure into the pension base for everyone. So everyone's facing tighter budgets now, and everyone's been hurt more now because of the pension crisis in California. Next slide, please. So, who pays? Again, what I just said suggests that the poorest and the most in need are really the ones who are paying the most. Taxpayers pay, employers pay more, obviously, and really employers are taxpayers. And then employees and retirees, because they're getting lower salaries, there are fewer staff, Oakland, as you know, there's been a dramatic increase in murders this year, but they don't have enough cops put on the street, in part because of pension pressures in the city of Oakland. So everyone's paying, but I really want to focus on the fact that for the most part, it's people who are poorer and less fortunate who are paying for this. Next slide, please. Why public pensions are unlikely to recover? Again, because they continue to assume that there are these unrealistic assumed rates of return. And they also assume, they're going to continue to assume actuarial and other assumptions that are probably not appropriate. And then the other problem is that local governments don't have a lot of opportunities to fix this problem. There are really limits to what you can do. Hang on one second. All right, sorry. Next slide, please. So what can you do if you're a local government to address this? And I typically put up this slide because there's not much you can do. There really isn't much because everything is more or less determined and driven out of Sacramento. It's sort of a one-size-fits-all policy or approach. If you go to the next slide, I do have some more serious, a couple of ideas that local governments can do. You can contribute more, but that means you have to have more. If you're a wealthy community, you can probably contribute a little more and sort of guard against what you think that that avalanche of debt that is coming your way is. You can. They're doing that in fact in Palo Alto. They're actually contributing about 1% more per year. They're assuming a 1% less rate of return so that they don't get stuck in the end. You can save and invest more. You can create a trust. There's a trust that has some benefits for local governments. Some people are doing. Pension obligation bonds are becoming kind of the rage. Pension obligation bond is when you simply provide, you borrow money to pay off debt. It is a system of arbitrage that doesn't work very well. And, there hasn't been much work done on this for about 10 or 15 years. But the most recent credible work that I've seen, this was, again, several years ago, showed that if you issued pension obligation bonds, you had about a 1 in 3 chance of actually coming out ahead. Some people argue the number's even less than that. You can try to lower your liabilities. That means lowering benefits. Really tough to do. There's something in California called the California rule that people assume means that once you are told you're going to get a benefit as a public employee, you have to get it. You can't modify it, even going forward. And at some point, the Supreme Court, which has looked at it twice actually, may actually modify that. The thing that local governments can do is they can address, and they can do this today, and some cities have, you can reduce retiree health obligations. So like co-teacher David Crane, whom you may know, has been focused on this year. And David's talked about how OPEB reform or retiree health reform would be ways for the state and local governments to actually reduce their retiree health. So there's an opportunity there, but not much beyond that. Can you guys hang on for 1 second again? I'm sorry. Hang on, I'll be right there.
No problem, Joe. We'll be
you.
here. And I'll take a minute to let everybody know that if you want to get specific information from the pension tracker, it's www.pensiontracker.org. So don't try to get it through .com. There's a lot of really good information on it. And this is, okay, I had it up there. This is a little bit of what it looks like. And up here, there is your basic search engine. And if you want to find out a specific city, county, or special district, just put in that name there, and then the information will start coming up. It's a very interesting system. It's actually quite easy to use. Some of the numbers that come up may be even beyond your pay grade, like it is mine, but even I can understand this. I'm going to take a moment, and while Joe's taking care of stuff, and I'll use let's say Concord, California, and what comes up is City of Concord, and I'm going to go there, and you will get specifics on the City of Concord as of 2018, and you can download a fact sheet, and here's CalPERS plans and all plans. I know that I'm not able to show you this too very well, but this will just give you an idea. So you can see the market liability, value of assets, market, pension debt, things like that. And if you're not sure, now here's actuarial liability. And if you go to the information button, it says the present value of future benefits for current members using discount rates, et cetera, et cetera. So it explains what that is. In some of, you can create a graph for selected categories. Frequently, and it's not on this sheet at the moment, if you're not sure what everything is or you want more information, the fact sheets, and it has links to more information as you get into it, so you will see a lot more. The fact sheet for 2018 for Concord, see, it breaks it all down, and it starts off the value of assets for all plans for the City of Concord in 2018 reached $320,951,197. Pretty darn accurate to a very small number, an increase of over 6.4% over 2017. So that's a little side note. It appears we have lost Joe for the moment. Looking. Yeah, oh boy, okay. I just gathered that you were not able to see what I was pointing at. And let's see, Denise, can you, let's see. Our office manager is working. We've had nothing but technical difficulties today, for which I apologize. Let's see here. I think we may need to conclude because Joe is not coming back.
Maybe he'll be signing on his computer. Maybe he's running inside.
Let's hope.
Let's give it
Give
a
it
minute.
another minute or two.
You might let people know about our committee,
Our committee. Oh,
pension committee.
yes, pension committee is still operational, though we've been on hiatus through some of COVID. Contra Costa Taxpayers has been instrumental in, I'm trying to do two things at once here.
Here he is.
There's Joe. Has been very busy analyzing the pension debt as it applies to Contra Costa County, and obviously to a certain extent the state, because you can't get one without the other. So we're still doing it. If you're interested in the pension difficulties, contact us at info@cocotax.org and we'll hook you up with our group. It's very interesting information. It's a bunch of people that really understand this, and I have learned a lot more than I think I ever wanted to know. And I apologize, I cannot get my laptop to show on the screen. So Joe, are you back now?
Susan, I'm back. Yeah, sorry about that.
It's all right, we'll manage. I think we're going to have you back, Joe.
Sure.
For any number of reasons, but I'll let you
Sure.
continue with your current presentation.
Well, so I was just finishing up at the very end, about retiree health debt, which local governments actually have control over. The the law is much clearer in terms of being able to reduce retiree health debt. It's not as big a problem as pensions, but at least it helps a little bit. Then the next slide is just contact information. And that contact information has my my email there, it's got my address there. So if you guys need to follow up in any way, please let me know.
Okay, Joe, I'm going to start, we'll leave that up for a couple of minutes while you're answering some questions, and then we will take down the slides, and
Okay.
we'll talk a little bit about what information is available on the
Right.
pension tracker. The first
Right.
question that we got was, how do you and your colleagues assess the prospects for reform of the California rule through the courts based on the California Supreme Court decision last August in the Alameda County employees case? While the court struck down the pension spiking abuses at issue in the case, the opinion seemed to reaffirm the California rule as establishing an implied contract covering pensions for public employees that begins on their first day of the employment. So if you could talk about your feelings on the California rule.
That's a great summary of what the court did. What I believe will happen is, because I don't see the right political decisions being made in the near future, or even over the next 5 years, let's say. I think that it is more likely than not that the court will at some point have to revisit this. And it's interesting. I mean, the exact same court may come to a very different conclusion, and they may come to a different conclusion because they realize that the problem is much more serious and severe than they thought. Just the last couple of years. So, bottom line is, I think the California rule will be modified at some point. I don't expect it the next year or two, but I certainly would think that would happen in the next few years.
Interesting. Next comment here. Private equity returns are typically calculated using internal rate of return rather than time-weighted return. Actual rates of return for private equity is really not known until there's a realizable event. I wonder how CalPERS calculates its portfolio returns when some of its asset returns are calculated using different methodologies, such as the IRR versus time-weighted.
Right. That is a great question. I do not know the answer to it. I will just say this. So one of the people who is an advisor to Pension Tracker is a guy named Bill Sharp. Folks who are in the business world typically have heard of the Sharp ratio, which is named after Bill. He won the Nobel Prize in economics in 1990. He and I have frequent conversations, and he typically says, Joe, I have no idea how they're coming up with this number. The point is that I'm sure there's a process, I'm sure there's a rationale, but it's not very transparent, and I can't say anything beyond that. One way to do it, I guess, is you could ask CalPERS directly. It's a different organization than it used to be. They're doing a much better job being transparent than they used to do, but it's still not as transparent as I'd like to see it. So bottom line is I don't know the exact answer, and I don't know if it's even published.
Thank you. That's interesting. And, I will let you know that we had requested speakers from CalPERS and CalSTRS to speak with us, either, at a committee meeting or at a full video. And they refused. They started giving us reasons why they couldn't make it on certain days or times. So I said, you name the date and time. And they said, no, we can't do it. So, and that was their public information officer. So that was interesting, but I will take it upon myself to send them a note asking that exact question. And let's see if we get an answer, and I'll share it with you, Joe.
And I'm glad to introduce you to some folks at CalPERS and and CalSTRS, especially CalPERS. I think they are making at least some. I think the majority of people are making an effort to do a better job at the people more transparent. And we've invited them to Stanford a couple times. They've come. So, offline, we can have that conversation. I can hopefully connect you with the right people there.
Excellent. The next comment is, with the baby boomers retiring, is there going to be a huge retirement influx and thus crashing the funded rate even more?
Probably not, because when they, the number of employees in state and local government is either stable or increases slightly. So if someone who is 60 or 65 retires, they'll be replaced by someone who is, much younger, someone who's 25 or 30, something like that. I don't think that's going to have a huge negative impact. I don't think this. I've not seen any data that would suggest that, certainly.
Okay. The next note here, I think you've already addressed it. How does the UC pension system compare? So you've already, if you wanted to add something to that.
So we used to track it more closely, but I kind of stopped a few years ago. Again, I think they're doing a better job than these other systems generally, because they've been more amenable to modification. And so I'm just guessing. I haven't looked at this for a couple of years. I'm guessing they're probably about 85% funded, something along those lines. So slightly better, but still not great.
Okay, and there's a comment here. Pension obligation bonds can skew real funding ratios too.
Yes, they do. Correct. Because what would happen is, so for example, the debt shows up on the county ledger, but it doesn't show up for the, under the pension system. So it's absolutely pernicious in that way. Agree.
Okay. And let's see. What are the options for correcting this problem? Is it reducing benefits for future employees, putting something into law that takes any investment benefits and puts them to the pension, rather than the legislature think that they have more to spend? So what do you think about ways to correct?
I think the most important step that any system or agency could take, if they could, would be to accurately realize and report the assets and liabilities. If you discount your liabilities at a very high rate, 7%, those liabilities are going to look smaller than they actually are. So if you did that, that would automatically force higher contribution rates. And if you had higher contribution rates, then maybe there'd be sufficient pressure at the local level for people to say, okay, we're stopping. We have to fix the system. The system is broken. So that's probably the best thing that I think to do. This that I would recommend. In a related issue, I think you have to have. Hang on one second. I think you have to have governance reform. You have to have a group of people who are fiduciaries who actually pay attention to the bottom line more closely than those who are there today. And the reason they don't do a good job today is because they're elected by employees, they're elected by retirees, they're appointed by politicians. They're not independent fiduciaries. So I said that's the second thing.
Okay. Our next question, we actually have about 5 more questions here. Have you looked at 115 Trust actual performance, such as PARS, to see if discount rate assumptions are reasonable? Our Alicia Minion is our person who's posing the question, and she says, I noted portfolio asset construction does not correlate to the expected rate of return. Solano County's 115 Trust contains portfolio investments that closely match a money market fund. Do you think there do you think there needs to be education to local agencies so they can appropriate, invest, or save using 115 trusts, which are supposed to be used as a means to shore up funding ratios?
Given what you just said, the answer is yes. However, I don't follow 115 trust that closely. But what the argument you made makes sense.
Okay. From our good friend Deborah Allen, from the member of the BART Board of Directors. She says she led our board in 2018 to begin discussing how to begin paying down what is now a $1.1 billion pension liability in their CalPERS plans. They were given two options, a 115 plan, which is what the board chose, or paying down layers of CalPERS liabilities. Can you comment on your thoughts on the effectiveness of those two options?
Yeah, I'd have to take a look at it more closely. If you want to share that in writing, I'm glad to do that.
Brad McCullough asks, why can't they just stop the ability to spike pensions? Is there no political will to do so? Good question.
Basically, that's the problem. I mean, if you have, again, I'm a Democrat, always have been. But Democrats to date, with the exception of Governor Brown, who did a little bit, haven't had the political will or shown the political will to take on much reform at all. Now, I have lots of private conversations with elected officials, and they say, we understand it's a big problem. We understand we've got to fix it. And then they say, yeah, but let's do it later. We've got COVID to worry about. We've got schools to worry about. We've got something else. It's just money. We'll fix it later. And those the people who are elected are typically funded to a great extent by those public employee unions. So you sort of expect them to do their bidding. That's what happens, unfortunately. But you need people who are independent. You need people who are more powerful politically, or politically powerful, who are willing to stand up and do the right thing. It's hard. It's hard to do, though.
Yeah. Actually, I know a little bit more about how that retroactive pay was the real deal breaker on pensions, especially the 3% at 50 for public safety, and then the retroactivity, which was never funded. They never had the money to fund that for the future and went ahead and did it. That's one of our big criticisms, is that people were unjustly enriched by that. Deb Allen has responded that the contributions to the 115 plan was one of the first steps taken to balance the budget. And they also considered rating the trust to pay current contributions. That was on the table. And she is going to continue to address that. And she agrees there's no political will to do so, and the unions are fighting it. And that's part of it.
And they're winning. I mean, if you're winning, why would you even negotiate? And that's effectively what's happened. People, public employee unions have really been winning for a long, long time, and that's just the norm here in California and many parts of the country. But at some point, this is going to hit the fan, and the crowd out's going to be much worse. And I keep arguing, and I come from a family of public employees, teachers, firefighter, paramedics, etc. And they're going to end up getting hurt in the end as well. This is not good for anybody. And, we really need union leadership, public employee union leadership, to go to their members and say, okay, you're still going to have a really, really, really good pension, but it's not going to be quite as good, but we have to do it to save the system.
Okay, Joe. Well, closing in here on time, and I know this has been kind of a struggle for a lot of us here today, but you've given us a ton of information. And I had started when you were off camera to explain how to use the search function on the pension tracker, but I could not get it coordinated with the video. So what I'm going to suggest is that we have you back and you can give us a tutorial on using the pension tracker. Again, it's pensiontracker.org, and you've all got his contact information if you need something beforehand. But I will say that the pension tracker is a wealth of information, a lot of specificity, and it's a great learning tool about the pension debt situation. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in. We will have this video online. I'll recommend that everybody get themselves a cup of coffee before they watch the video again. And everybody be well, be safe, be well informed. Take care all. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.